Manufacture, transfer, sales, possession of large ammunition feeding devices. Yesterday, our country was forced to endure yet another mass shooting. Horrific crimes to obtain powerful military-style weapons.
Clarified that bump stock type devices are machine guns and are prohibited by federal law.
To propose regulations to ban all devices that turn legal weapons into machine guns.
The number of so-called assault rifles, what you all are calling assault rifles, had doubled.
3-round burst or semi-automatic. Those firearms are not allowed for purchase in the United States today.
Ban on rapid-fire gun bump stocks. An agreement was reached by the Supreme Court to decide whether or not a ban on bump stocks, which are gun accessories that allow semi-auto weapons to fire rapidly like mash guns, violates federal law. The prohibition was enacted during the Trump administration. At the beginning of the following year, the Supreme Court will hear arguments regarding a regulation that was implemented by the Justice Department in response to a mass slaying that occurred in Las Vegas in 2017. There have been a variety of opinions made by federal appeals courts regarding the question of whether or not the regulation that defines a bump stock as a mash gun is in compliance with federal law. A decision by the Fifth United States Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans that invalidated the ban will be challenged by the justices, who have stated that they will hear the appeal filed by the Biden administration. A challenge to another federal legislation that aims to keep weapons away from those who are subject to domestic abuse restraining orders is already being considered by the Supreme Court. This case is a direct result of the landmark decision that was handed down in 2022, in which the conservative majority of 6 justices increased arms rights. Not the right to keep and bear arms, as outlined in the Second Amendment, is at issue in this latest case. Rather, the question at hand is whether or not the Trump administration adhered to the federal law when it changed the regulation regarding bump stocks. The year 2019 marked the beginning of the prohibition on bump stocks. It was the result of the slaying that took place in Las Vegas, in which the perpetrator, a 64-year-old retired postal service worker and high-stakes gambler, used attack-style weapons to fire more than 1,000 rounds into a crowd of 22 music fans in 11 minutes. An overwhelming majority of the guns were outfitted with bump stock devices and mags with a high capacity. The incident resulted in the deaths of 58 individuals in total, with 2 more persons passing away subsequently. A number of hundreds were injured. An about-face was made by the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, or the ATF, when it was announced that bump stocks would be prohibited by the Trump administration. An investigation conducted by the government in 2010 during the Obama administration came to the conclusion that a bump stock should not be categorized as a mash gun and, as a result, should not be prohibited by federal law. Following the slaying that took place in Las Vegas, the authorities re-examined the conclusion and discovered that it was erroneous. As stated by the ATF, bump stocks are able to utilize the recoil energy of a semi-auto rifle in such a way that a trigger resets and continues firing without additional physical manipulation of the trigger by the shooter. According to the records of the court, a shooter is required to keep continual forward pressure on the weapon with the hand that's not being used for slaying and constant pressure on the trigger with the finger that's being used for the trigger. In January, the full United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit concluded 13-3 that in order to prohibit bump stocks, they would need to modify federal law. In a letter that she authored for the Fifth Circuit, Judge Jennifer Walker Elrod stated that the definition of mash gun that's outlined in the National Firearms Act and the Arms Control Act doesn't apply to devices known as bump stocks. On the other hand, a panel of 3 judges from the Federal Appeals Court in Washington examined the same text and arrived at a different judgment. In a decision that was published by the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, Judge Robert Wilkins stated that under the best interpretation of the statute, a bump stock is a self-regulating mechanism that allows a shooter to shoot more than one shot through a single pull of the trigger. According to the National Firearms Act and the Arms Control Act, it is considered a mash gun because of this. This case, Garland v. Cargill 22-967, is scheduled to reach a conclusion by the beginning of summer.
Manufacture, transfer, sales, possession of large ammunition feeding devices.
3-round burst or semi-automatic. Those firearms are not allowed for purchase in the United States today.
They should be respected.
Reclaiming my time. So, Mr.
You
Chairman,
can
I'd
yield to
like
me.
40 seconds
I've seen
back on
my
the clock.
constituents die in battle.
To a member on the Democratic side that served in a combat area designated zone and deployment of our country.
In the Heller case, the Supreme Court made clear that the Second Amendment protects firearms in common use.
This is a lever action. Under this bill, lever actions apparently are okay.
Feinstein's ban on attack weapons fades. One of the first votes new Democratic Senator Martin Heinrich cast was against legislation from Senator Dianne Feinstein to reinstate an attack weapons ban in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook school slaying. In the decade since, as mass slayings have touched almost every corner of the United States, the New Mexico senator, an avid hunter once endorsed by the NRA, has been considering what it would take to draft legislation that avoids banning arms that Americans use for legitimate purposes while still saving lives. He has also watched his two sons grow up learning how to hunt, as well as how to duck and cover in mass shooter drills that bring him to tears. I think there's a generational shift happening, Heinrich said in an interview with the Associated Press. It really made those of us who grew up inside gun culture reevaluate our views and think hard about, like, this is not a black and white issue, he said. You can accept the fact that guns are a legitimate tool without accepting that you should be able to own firearms that are really designed to inflict mass lethality. On firearms legislation, though, he said, I've come at it a little differently, in part because of my sort of engineering background. His intent over these past several years, he said, was to figure out how to build something that I think creates a regulatory structure that's not focused on the individual firearm model, but the mechanical properties that make these things dangerous. And he said to write it in a way that hopefully, one, we can eventually pass, and two, that can stand up to the Supreme Court. In this Supreme Court, and not in the 1990 Supreme Court. Heinrich choked up when he recalled watching his one son take cover at the side of a workman with what appeared to be a firearm entering a community room where they were meeting in Albuquerque. It was a thermal imaging gun. They've both grown up in firearms, and a lot like their, really positive memories involve firearms, he said, describing the family's pursuit of elk, deer, javelina, and quail for food. But they also grew up in the era of learning to do mass shooter drills and lockdowns, and all of the just horrible baggage that creates, he said, adding that one of his sons marched in Washington in the aftermath of the Parkland school slaying in Florida. And I figured, in conversations with them, they were able to draw a line, and if kids can do that when they're in their teens, I figured policymakers should figure it out.
Yesterday, our country was forced to endure yet another mass shooting.
You say that crime went down, but did you know that the sales of the so-called assault weapons went up?
Piece of legislation and voting on whether this nation is going to be all in on a new nuclear arms race.
And they're coming for your firearms. 6 weeks ago, it was the red flag law.
The most popular handgun in the United States that was purchased is the Glock 19.
Horrific crimes to obtain powerful military-style weapons.
The Second Amendment says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Congress on arm control. The Supreme Court hears oral arguments in a case that could limit the legislative and political power of Congress and local lawmakers to regulate gun possession nationwide. The case, U.S. v. Rahimi, is the first of dozens of challenges to federal and state arm control laws to reach the justices since their decision last year in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. An appeals court leaned on the reasoning of that Bruin decision to strike down as unconstitutional a decades-old law that bans gun possession for anyone subject to certain domestic violence restraining orders. The Biden administration, members of Congress, and legal experts have said a Supreme Court ruling against the domestic violence law could restrict what else Congress could do to address armed crime nationwide. Andrew Willinger, executive director of the Duke Center for Firearms Law, said the arguments in the case implicate a broad range of federal prohibitions on gun possession, including the ban for convicted felons. A ruling that tosses those prohibitions could ossify the already intractable politics around arm control, Willinger said. I'm not really sure where Congress goes from there. I think maybe the focus shifts to the similar provisions in effect at the state level, Willinger said. Senator Chris Coons, Democrat from Delaware, said a ruling against the law could also disrupt the political dynamic of such legislation because arms rights groups likely would use it for wider advocacy against arm control legislation. If there is a broader sense that the Supreme Court is beginning to move in an action that restricts our range of action for gun safety, that may create a political sense that this is just not something we're going to be able to legislate on, Coons said. Coons, a member of the Judiciary Commission, said such a decision could also affect the dynamic between lawmakers when discussing what legislation would be possible. That would be a big step backwards, and that would make any future progress even less likely, he said. A bipartisan armed crime reduction law that was enacted last year arose out of specific conversations between legislators in response to mass slayings, Coons said. That armed crime prevention bill included only a handful of arm control provisions, such as expanding background checks for gun purchasers under age 21 to include records from when they were minors. Still, the bill, along with the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization last year, contained the first arm control provisions to pass into law in years. Coons was one of the bipartisan sponsors of that reauthorization law, which increased notification requirements for failed background checks. He said the best hope for passing more legislation would have to come after next year's elections. Even before the case, other members of Congress have downplayed the possibility of further arm control legislation this year. In response to a slaying spree in Lewiston, Maine on October 25th, Speaker Mike Johnson, a Republican from Louisiana, said, "Now is not the time for legislation," and House Republicans updated a spending bill set for floor debate this month with several provisions that seek to curb arm control enforcement.
Clarified that bump stock type devices are machine guns and are prohibited by federal law.
There's a hearing that you can't be at, your counsel can't be present, you haven't been charged with the crime. For years, the Democrats told us we're not coming for your guns. Oh, yes, they are.
The number of so-called assault rifles, what you all are calling assault rifles, had doubled.
The previous ban on assault weapons. This has nothing to do with the Second Amendment.
To propose regulations to ban all devices that turn legal weapons into machine guns.
I'd also like to address the House on an issue that occurred yesterday in Maine. Another assault weapon.
Conviction challenged. The case set for argument comes out of a Biden administration appeal of a decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit that tossed out the gun possession conviction of Zachary Rahimi. The Fifth Circuit panel found that the statute violated Rahimi's Second Amendment rights based on the Supreme Court's decision in Bruin, which said that in part that arm control had to focus on the text and historical tradition of the Second Amendment. Briefs in the Supreme Court in the Rahimi case frequently have their own analysis of the history. Rahimi's attorneys urged the Supreme Court to adopt the Fifth Circuit's view that focused on a history where domestic abusers may suffer criminal or social consequences but not be disarmed. American jurisdictions didn't ban firearm possession for citizens who retained their position in the political community, Rahimi's brief said. Rahimi's brief also argued at one point that the Constitution didn't give Congress the power to take away other constitutional rights. Congress cannot completely ban protective order respondents from speaking, assembling, petitioning, going to church, traveling to other states, voting, holding public office, filing a lawsuit, giving testimony, or voting. That means Congress cannot completely ban them from keeping weapons either, Rahimi wrote.
Announced the creation of the first ever White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention.
Today's Democrats, when it comes to guns, their objective is to disarm law-abiding citizens.
It's time again to ban assault weapons, high-capacity magazines. We need to ban high-capacity magazines, the ability to shoot 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 bullets.
They say they just want to regulate guns. They don't. They want to abolish guns.
I think careful consideration about who should have access to guns is particularly important, and what kinds of weapons.
This will not do any good. It will harm Americans, and it undermines our foundational liberties.
All have some of the strictest gun country laws in the country, including limiting magazines to only 10 rounds.
Members of Congress said that they've relied on the law Rahimi has challenged for decades in a brief from Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota, Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, Republican from Pennsylvania, and Republican Debbie Dingell, Democrat from Michigan, in the case. The group argued that Congress had enacted the law through a bipartisan and deliberative legislative process, and Congress had continued to build on that foundation in a deliberative and bipartisan manner. The Biden administration argued in a brief that Congress has long had the power to disarm people who are not responsible citizens. Although different statutes disqualify different groups at different times, they reflect the same enduring principle. Legislators may disarm those who are not law-abiding responsible citizens, the brief said. Willinger pointed out that the Biden administration's argument is broader than may be needed to defend the Civil Domestic Violence Order statute, hinting that the Supreme Court may soon hear cases on a broad range of federal gun prohibitions. The justices also set themselves up to decide another gun restriction case Friday, agreeing to decide a challenge to a Trump-era rule on bump stocks, devices that allow a rifle to fire multiple times with one press of a trigger on grounds that it violates federal law. National permit requirement. The bill proposes a national permit that individuals must obtain to purchase firearms and ammunition. This permit includes a requirement to be at least 21 years old, undergo a written and range test, pass a background check, and pay associated fees. This proposal appears to conflict with the recent Supreme Court decision in the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which emphasized the individual's right to bear arms.
In order to do this, Democrats in this body are willing to take away a citizen's God-given right, yes, God-given right.
They want to take away law-abiding citizens' ability to purchase the firearm of their choice, and don't let them fool you.
Owners, many of whom are disabled veterans, must destroy the braces or their weapons.
People have considered the handgun to be the quintessential self-defense weapon.
We're going to centralize, accelerate, and intensify our work to save more lives more quickly. Where our voices are so loud, our determination so clear that we can no longer be stopped. Last time we established universal background checks to require safe storage of firearms. It's time. And it's hard to say, well over 40,000 deaths due to gun violence.
Many argue that such a national permit system could be deemed unconstitutional. Universal background checks. The bill also advocates for universal background checks, necessitating all transfers go through a federal firearms license or FFL dealer. This would impose a background check on the purchaser, triggering a mandatory 7-day waiting period. Additionally, individuals would still need to demonstrate possession of the national permit to purchase firearms and ammunition. Other restrictive measures. Beyond the permit and background check requirements, the bill reportedly includes bans on suppressors, a 7-day waiting period for all transactions, increased age restrictions, a national red flag law, and prohibitions on 3D printing of firearm components like polymer 80s. Potential actions to take. Number 1, contact your representatives. Reach out to your elected officials to express your concerns and opposition to the bill. Provide well-reasoned arguments about the potential infringement on constitutional rights. Number 2, engage in grassroots advocacy. Join or support organizations that advocate for responsible gun ownership and lobby against overly restricted legislation. Grassroots movements can have a significant impact on public opinion and policy decisions. Number 3, educate others. Share accurate information about the proposed bill with friends, family, and social networks. Educating others about the potential consequences of such legislation can help build a broader base of opposition.
That's not a right of government. That's a right that each of us has.
By the way, for comparison, when Democrats were in charge and Donald Trump, of all people, was president, we had enacted 21 laws.
So there is a significant access to weapons. There's no secret about that in the United States.
We have a Second Amendment because we understand in this country that there are some things, inalienable rights.
The Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights is not a public health crisis.
And said he supports a ban on the sale of assault weapons, which there's no such thing, and high-capacity magazines.
Number 4, participate in public discourse. Attend public hearings, town hall meetings, or any forums where the bill is discussed. Present your perspective, ask questions, and engage in respectful dialogue with those on both sides of the issue. Number 5. Legal challenges. If the bill passes, individuals and organizations may explore legal avenues to challenge its constitutionality. This could involve filing lawsuits based on perceived violations of Second Amendment rights. Enhancements to 922G sections. The bill aims to strengthen federal prohibitions related to domestic crime restraining orders and other restrictions under Section 922G. This is notable given the ongoing Supreme Court review in the Rahimi case, which questions the constitutionality of certain aspects of domestic violence restraining order restrictions. It's interesting that the bill includes additional language in light of the pending Supreme Court decision. Age restriction increase. The proposed legislation seeks to raise the age for purchasing all firearms and ammunition to 21. This aligns with existing age restrictions for certain firearm purchases in various states, but would extend this requirement nationally. Attack weapons and mag ban. The bill introduces a national ban on so-called attack weapons following the California model. It defines prohibited firearms based on specific features such as a detachable mag, pistol grip, forward grip, collapsible stock, or threaded barrel.
In 2021, you were roughly 3 times less likely to be murdered here in Florida, in Orange County, or in Tampa.
We're issued weapons that allow for fully automatic and 3-round bursts. That is not available for purchase in the United States.
They don't care about that fundamental liberty law-abiding citizens in this country enjoy.
Additionally, the bill includes a ban on mags holding more than 10 rounds, akin to existing restrictions in some states. Suppressor restrictions. The bill goes further by attempting to tighten regulations on suppressors. It makes it unlawful to import, sell, manufacture, transfer, or possess a firearm silencer or muffler. Unlike some prospective bans, this bill includes language for the seizure and forfeiture of suppressors, indicating a lack of grandfathering for existing legally owned items. Marking and identification requirements. For items made after the enactment of the bill, a marking and identification requirement is proposed. This includes a serial number and date identification on rifles and mags. There's also a reporting requirement to distinguish items owned before the ban from those acquired afterward. In conclusion, the bill appears comprehensive and aims to implement stringent arm control measures at the national level. Concerned individuals may consider engaging in advocacy, contacting representatives, and staying informed about the legislative process to voice their opinions and potentially influence the outcome. Unpacking the sweeping arm control bill. It appears that the proposed arm control bill encompasses an extensive wish list of legislative measures incorporating various restrictions and bans on firearms, mags, and suppressors. Despite the challenging odds of passing such comprehensive legislation, it's evident that proponents are determined to push their agenda forward. The bill includes provisions ranging from a mandatory 7-day waiting period for firearm purchases to age restrictions and bans to specific firearm features. The attempt to tighten regulations on suppressors and the inclusion of marking and identification requirements for newly manufactured items further highlight the bill's ambitious scope. While the current political landscape may not favor the passage of such a bill, recent history has shown that unexpected events and shifting political dynamics can influence legislative outcomes. It's crucial for advocates of responsible gun ownership to remain vigilant and actively engage in the democratic process. The reminder of past instances, such as the National Rifle Mag ban, serves as a cautionary note against complacency.
Do something. Please do something.
This bill, and it gets brushed aside, raised the age limit. Well, there are constitutional questions to that in the 4th Circuit, 9th Circuit, and other circuits.
That these kinds of engagements have a permanent effect on young children.
Your priority is disarming a law-abiding citizen, but not going after the violent criminal. And
gives private citizens the right to possess a firearm.
The administration has announced dozens of executive actions to reduce gun violence, more than any of my predecessors at this point in their presidencies. We still need to ban, in my view, AR-15 firearms, assault weapons, once again. I signed into law the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the most significant gun safety law in almost 30 years.
The political landscape can change, and it only takes one event to catalyze support for restrictive measures. drawing parallels to previous instances where bipartisan efforts led to anti-gun legislation. The need for proactive advocacy becomes apparent. The call to action is clear. Individuals concerned about these proposed measures should voice their opinions and contact their representatives. By actively participating in the democratic process, citizens can contribute to the dialogue surrounding arm control and make their concerns known. It's essential to advocate for responsible and informed policymaking that respects individuals' rights while addressing legitimate concerns related to public safety. In the face of uncertainty, ongoing vigilance and engagement in civic discourse remain critical. Staying informed, expressing concerns to elected officials, and participating in grassroots efforts can collectively influence the outcome of proposed legislation. And that's going to do it for this video. See you next time, and bye for now.